For 3 furious days during the sweltering summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia slammed into General George Gordon Meade's Union Army of the Potomac across the rolling fields, ridges, and hills near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lee first struck Meade's advance corps on the early morning of July 1st, west of Gettysburg. But the Union troops, though defeated, withdrew to the heights east and south of the town by evening. Lee struck the left, then the right flanks of Meade's army on July 2nd, but met with only limited success. The fighting had been savage. Losses had been appalling. Finally, Lee struck the Union center on the afternoon of July 3rd. Nearly 3 full divisions had advanced across almost a mile of open fields in the face of horrific small arms and artillery fire, mercilessly shredding the Confederate ranks. By the time the attack fell upon the Union center, there was too little left of the attacking Confederate divisions to carry it. The Battle of Gettysburg had been decided, but the struggle to save Lee's shattered army was just beginning. The bloodied survivors of the divisions of Generals Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble stream back down the forward slopes of Cemetery Ridge, across the Emmitsburg Road, and into these fields here. Some were using their muskets as crutches. Others were being carried by their comrades. The losses had been absolutely appalling. Of the 10,500 men and officers who entered the attack, some 6,700 were casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. Of Pickett's brigade commanders, all of them were down. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead was mortally wounded. Brigadier General Richard Brooke Garnett was killed and his body not recovered. Brigadier General James Lawson Kemper was dangerously wounded, a bullet having entered his groin and ranged up his spinal column. Of the 15 regimental commanders in Pickett's division alone, 13 were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Of the lieutenant colonels, 3 were killed and 8 were wounded dangerously. In Pettigrew's command, these losses continued, Pettigrew himself being wounded. His own colonel of his brigade, Colonel James Keith Marshall, was dead, 2 bullets having hit his head simultaneously. 3,500 of Pettigrew's and Trimble's officers and men were down. Losses in some of these regiments were just unbelievable. In the 11th Mississippi, 87% of the men were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Of the University Grays of the 11th Mississippi, 100% of them were lost, as were 100% of the color company of the 38th North Carolina. General Lee rode out into these fields here, where only 50 minutes before his attack had been launched. He tried to console his men as they streamed back toward Seminary Ridge. But General Lee was facing the most ominous task of any commander, and that is to retreat an army after a lost battle. For Lee, he would have to move out of Gettysburg. 50,000 officers and men, more than 20,000 non-combatant support personnel, more than 10,000 critically wounded and sick. He would have to move 57 miles of quartermaster, subsistence, ordnance, and ambulance trains. All this, he would have to move 50 miles to the Potomac River and cross a mountain range, the passes of which were 400 feet above the valley floors. He would do this with an enemy victorious, chasing him and trying to move in for the kill. It would be aided by 2 more Union armies moving into the area, and Lee would face 10 consecutive days of torrential rains. Lee was indeed embarking upon an operation that was one of the most difficult he would face in his military career. It would be the retreat from Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee was 56 years old. He was robust, but had been weakened by a heart attack the previous spring, and more recently, dysentery. He was exacting, but what Lee faced on the late afternoon of July 3rd was daunting. The two armies suffered combined casualties that totaled at least 51,000 in 3 days of combat. The whole battlefield, wrote one observer, was one trodden, miry waste with corpses at every step. The official count of casualties in Lee's army read 20,400 killed, wounded, missing, and captured. Wounded were taken off the battlefields on litters carried by drummers, musicians, convalescent soldiers, and African-American slaves of officers and enlisted men, many of whom wore the distinctive badges of the ambulance corps. Wounded were brought to the division hospitals as quickly as the transportation equipment allowed. Surgeons and assistant surgeons on the battlefield and in ambulance depots provided the necessary triage, while their counterparts at the division hospitals worked feverishly to save critical cases by means of amputation or resection. There were 10 division hospitals behind Lee's 6-mile-long lines at Gettysburg. Each of them had been established by the Corps and division quartermasters in consultation with the medical director of the Corps and the chief surgeon of the division as each division moved onto the battlefields. The size of the quartermaster and subsistence trains gathered around each division hospital told the story of the purpose behind Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania. Although Lee had won significant victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville in the months preceding his army's movement across the Potomac River, they were not enough to bring the war to an end. Rather, they had seriously depleted Lee's army. Between June 1, 1862, and the day Lee launched his invasion of Pennsylvania, his army had suffered more than 60,000 casualties. Added to that, Virginia had been fought over for 2 years. Northern Virginia, that area between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers, was a wasteland. It had been stripped of all livestock and crops, and a serious drought in the fall of 1862 had only worsened the problem. Lee entered Pennsylvania to forage his army. He needed to feed his more than 40,000 horses and mules, and he needed food and equipment for the men. From the moment Lee's army entered Maryland and Pennsylvania, the troops scoured the countryside in organized quartermaster and subsistence teams, purchasing, impressing, and even confiscating everything they could find that was useful to the army. Quartermaster records still extant in the collections of the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, illustrate how systematic the foraging was. Indeed, items needed were written atop large grids, all pre-prepared, that were filled in by quartermasters as those items were found. Although Lee had admonished his men not to pillage or otherwise harm private property, his General Order No. 72, issued in late June 1863, actually instructed quartermasters and commissaries of subsistence to organize teams to obtain the necessary supplies and livestock. His hungry men foraged for themselves in spite of the general order. It is estimated that Lee's army purchased, impressed, and confiscated nearly 50,000 head of cattle, nearly 50,000 head of sheep, thousands of hogs, and at least 20,000 horses and mules. Many of them were herded south to the Army's supply base at Winchester, Virginia, while the Army was still marching into Pennsylvania. Illustrative of how thorough was the acquisition of quartermaster and subsistence supplies, Lee's wagon trains by July 3, 1863, were altogether more than 57 miles in length. The quartermaster and subsistence wagon trains, together with herds of livestock, were found around each division hospital site. As Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell's Corps advanced into Pennsylvania ahead of Lee's remaining corps and had foraged for more than 2 weeks prior to it entering the fighting at Gettysburg on July 1, each of its 3 division trains of quartermaster, subsistence, and ordnance stores and ambulances extended for nearly 7 miles, making the corps train nearly 21 miles in length. Ewell's Corps had also collected supplies for the Army in general. Major General Edward Allegheny Johnson's division of Ewell's Corps had brought to Gettysburg not only its own division wagon trains, but a reserve train of purchased, impressed, and confiscated stores that by July 3rd was nearly 20 miles in length. It was parked 8 miles behind Lee's battle lines along the road between Cashtown and Fairfield. Lieutenant Generals Ambrose Powell Hill's and James Longstreet's corps had not foraged in Pennsylvania as long as General Ewell's troops. Consequently, the wagon trains parked around their division hospitals were not as lengthy as those in Ewell's divisions. Nevertheless, each of their division wagon trains extended for at least 3 miles, making their corps trains each nearly 10 miles in length. The Cavalry Division of Lee's Army, commanded by Major General J.E.B. Stuart, established its own division hospitals along the Hunterstown Road in and near the village of Hunterstown. On Lee's left flank was Ewell's Corps. Its left was held by Johnson's division, whose division hospital was made up of a cluster of brigade hospitals all located out the York Turnpike and the Hunterstown Road. The Henry A. Picking Farm and Schoolhouse, the Alexander Bueller, and W. Henry and Catherine Montfort, Martin Shaler, and Elizabeth Weibel farms form the division hospital site. Ambulance depots had been established along the Hanover Road at the Christian and Susan Benner farm just below Culp's Hill and the Daniel Lady farm nearby. Major General Jubal A. Early's division established its hospital site in Wagon Park using a cluster of farms and farmhouses along the Harrisburg and Carlisle roads north of Gettysburg. Under the direction of Chief Surgeon Dr. Samuel B. Morrison, the John S. Crawford House and Farm, Josiah Benner House and Bank Barn, the William Ross House and Jacob Keim House and Farm, along with the dormitory of Pennsylvania College, formed the division hospital site. The division hospital site of Major General Robert E. Rhodes's division was located out the Mummersburg Road behind the division's July 1 battle lines at the Jacob Hankey and David Shriver farms. Ewell's hospitals were all under the direction of his medical director, Dr. Hunter McGuire, and his chief quartermaster, Major John Alexander Harmon. General Hill's hospitals were mostly situated behind his battle lines established along the Chambersburg Pike during the first day's fighting. The hospitals of both Major Generals Henry Heath and William Dorsey Pender's divisions were located out the Chambersburg Pike around the village of Seven Stars. The Samuel Lohr Farm, Andrew Heinzelman Tavern, and David Whistler Farm formed the site of the 2 combined division hospitals. Major General Richard H. Anderson's Division Hospital was established on the Adam Butt Farm along the Her Ridge Road, 3 miles behind its battle lines formed on July 2nd. All of the division hospital sites for the divisions of James Longstreet's Corps were found along and south of the Fairfield Road. The hospital of Major General George E. Pickett's division was located at a cluster of farms along Marsh Creek, south of the Fairfield Road. Chief Surgeon Dr. Magnoa Lewis oversaw the division's 3 brigade hospitals established at the Francis Bream Mineral and Flour Mill, the nearby farmhouse of William E. Myers, and the John F. Curran's farm. Major General Lafayette McLaws's division hospital sites were found in a cluster of brigade sites located near the hospital of Pickett's division. Francis Bream's Black Horse Tavern on the north side of the Fairfield Road, along with the houses and farms of John S. Crawford and Samuel Johns along Marsh Creek south of the Fairfield Road, were used by the surgeons of McLaws's brigades. We're here at the Francis Bream House, otherwise known as the Black Horse Tavern, on the afternoon of July 2nd. Francis Bream's home and the barn and farm complex were selected by the chief quartermaster of McLaws's division to be the hospital site for Kershaw's brigade. And it was here that Dr. Simon Baruch of the 3rd South Carolina Battalion served his troops in the barn here and in the surgery center inside the house. The division hospital site chosen by the chief surgeon of Major General John Bell Hood's division, Dr. John Thompson Darby, and Hood's chief quartermaster, was the John Edward Plunk Farm, located along the Willoughby Run Road. We're here at the John E. Plank Farm, about 4 miles south of Gettysburg and 3 miles behind the main Confederate lines assaulting the base of Little Round Top and Devil's Den. Back here, more than 1,500 critically wounded cases were brought. They were operated on in the lower floor of the Plank House, and after their operations, mostly amputations, they were brought out into the fields where they rested under shelter halves that were pitched in these fields north of the house. And if you can just imagine, this hospital site now was like every other of Lee's 10 division hospitals. Behind this building were all the quartermaster and subsistence trains of Hood's division. Those trains amounted to more than 3 miles of wagons and their 4-horse or 6-horse teams. So you can just picture not only all the surgery going on, all the wounded cases, all the burials of those who died under the operating knife, but hundreds of wagons and their 4- and 6-horse teams parked behind and around the house. On July 5th, this hospital was evacuated, and those critically wounded cases who could still ambulate were instructed to do so and to move out into the lines of retreat. Those wounded cases who could not walk were lifted into ambulances and taken out of here. And more than 515 of Hood's soldiers, too desperately wounded to go on, were left here to fall into the hands of the enemy. The numbers of wounded were not Lee's only concern. Gathered near the hospital sites of Heath's and Pender's divisions and McLaws's and Pickett's divisions along Marsh Creek on either side of the Fairfield Road were more than 4,000 Union prisoners of war. Lee would offer to exchange them, but General George Gordon Meade would decline due to War Department directives cutting off exchanges. Lee would have to take those prisoners back to Virginia. The task of withdrawing his army, given its enormity and the numbers and conditions of its wounded, and the numbers of prisoners of war in his care, presented General Lee with one of the greatest challenges of his military career. 10 miles to his rear was the South Mountain Range that rose 700 feet above the plain where his army rested. The 2 roads Lee protected, the Chambersburg Pike and the Fairfield Road, wound their ways through passes that were 300 feet below the mountain summits. From there, Lee's army had to reach the Potomac River, more than 50 miles distant. After Lee determined that an immediate counterattack was unlikely and that the center of his lines was capable of resisting an attack, he rode to his headquarters tent on Seminary Ridge across the Chambersburg Pike. The sun was setting. There he rested briefly and solidified his own plans for a retreat back to Virginia. By 10 o'clock in the evening, Lee was back down Seminary Ridge at the headquarters tent of General A.P. Hill at the Emanuel Pitzer House. There, with the light of a flickering candle, Lee and Hill discussed the retreat. They were soon joined by Lieutenant Generals James Longstreet and Richard S. Ewell. Hill's corps occupied the center of the Confederate lines. and Lee determined it should lead any retreat using the Fairfield Road. Lee recognized his army was ill-situated to begin a withdrawal. Its lines extended for nearly 6 miles, following the contours of the defense lines established by General Mead's Union Army. Lee's army, unlike Mead's, was operating on exterior lines, making communication difficult. Mead, on the other hand, was operating on interior lines. The first order of business for Lee was to correct his army's positions. He first looked to Ewell's Corps, the divisions of which occupied ground below Culp's and Cemetery Hills, south and east of Gettysburg, and in the town of Gettysburg below Cemetery Hill. He ordered them to withdraw to Seminary and Oak Ridges and come into line with Hill's and Longstreet's corps. To accomplish the movement, Ewell ordered his medical director, Major Hunter McGuire, to oversee the evacuation of all sick and wounded from the division hospitals behind Early's and Johnson's divisions and those depots of Rodes's division in the town of Gettysburg. Those sick and wounded capable of making the journey back to Virginia would be placed in ambulances or other wagons commandeered for such a purpose and driven out the Mummasburg Road and Chambersburg Pike to the Her Ridge Road. They would then be driven down the Her Ridge Road to the Fairfield Road, where they would continue to positions on either side of the Fairfield Road, where they would wait for instructions to begin the movement toward the Potomac River. Lee ordered Ewell's Corps to evacuate those positions promptly. Rodes's division, holding a line in town and below Cemetery Hill, was to literally about face and march west to Seminary Ridge, occupying the summit of the ridge between the Chambersburg Pike and the Fairfield Road. Early's and Johnson's divisions were directed to evacuate their positions below Cemetery and Culp's Hills and march out the Mummasburg Road and the Chambersburg Pike, Johnson filling a line along Oak Ridge between the Chambersburg Pike and the Mummasburg Road, and Early occupying McPherson's Ridge in reserve on either side of the Chambersburg Pike behind Rodes's and Johnson's divisions. Lee directed Hill's Corps, occupying the center of the Confederate line, to remain where it was, strengthening the line so as to resist any attack. Longstreet's corps was directed to about face and march back over the fields it had won on July 2nd and return to Seminary Ridge, refusing its far right flank in order to resist any attempts on the part of the enemy to attack the line in that direction. Lee instructed Ewell, Hill, and Longstreet to order their men to construct heavy breastworks along the defense line from Oak Ridge on the left all the way to the right flank on Seminary Ridge near the Emmitsburg Road. Within hours, a new line began to take shape. Fences were stripped of rails and barns and outbuildings were dismantled for log beams that formed the breastworks that were constructed, such as those shown in the famous picture of 3 captured Confederates sitting and standing alongside the breastworks constructed by Rodes's division along Seminary Ridge. Lee continued to plan the retreat. All along, he had carefully positioned his army to protect the approaches to 2 principal passes through the South Mountain Range, Cashtown Pass and Monterey Pass. The Cashtown Pass carried the Chambersburg Pike through 700-foot-high mountain range gradually. Monterey Pass, on the other hand, was steep. The Chambersburg Pike was macadamized. The Fairfield Road and the Mariah Furnace Road to Monterey were not. Both of those routes had served as essential elements of Lee's lines of support and communication that extended all the way down the Cumberland Valley to the Shenandoah, some 200 miles to Stanton, Virginia on the Virginia Central Railroad, a rail line which ran 100 miles east from Stanton to Richmond. Along that line, Lee communicated with his President and Secretary of War. His army forwarded and received supplies and even forwarded and received mail throughout the entire campaign. Lee would fall back upon the very line of support and communication he had so carefully protected throughout the campaign and the ensuing battles at Gettysburg. Lee determined that the wagon and ambulance trains of the Army would lead the retrograde movement. Hill's and Longstreet's corps trains, along with Stuart's cavalry division trains, would assemble on the Chambersburg Pike, and moved toward the Cumberland Valley and the Potomac River by means of the Cashtown Pass and near roads connecting the Chambersburg Pike with the Cumberland Valley Turnpike to Williamsport, Maryland on the Potomac River. Lee directed General John D. Imboden and his independent cavalry brigade to guide and protect those wagon and ambulance trains of Hill's and Longstreet's Corps and Stuart's cavalry division. The wagon and ambulance trains of Ewell's 3 divisions, as well as the reserve wagon train assembled by Ewell's Corps and parked 8 miles in Lee's rear between Fairfield and Cashtown, would lead the Army on the Fairfield Road to the Mariah Furnace Road and over Monterey Pass to Hagerstown and finally Williamsport. Protecting nearly 40 miles of those trains would be the chief quartermaster of Ewell's Corps, Major John Alexander Harmon. General Ewell went up to Harmon and pointing his index finger at Harmon's nose, he said, "I want you to get those trains across the Potomac River, or I don't want to see your face in this army again." Hill's Corps would follow Ewell's wagon and ambulance trains. As Hill's Corps evacuated the center of the defense lines, Longstreet's and Ewell's Corps would evacuate their positions on the right and left, respectively. Ewell's troops would serve as the screening force, protecting Longstreet's Corps as it marched into line behind Hill. Once all of Longstreet's Corps was on the march up the Fairfield Road, Ewell's Corps would then begin its retrograde movement. As in all movements of these armies, the roadways would be occupied only by artillery battalions and those wagon trains accompanying the troops. The infantrymen would march in columns on either side of the roads. Pioneer teams would advance ahead of the marching troops, tearing down fences and obstructions to allow the infantrymen to pass without impediment. To add even more difficulty to the operation, Lee's pontoon train and bridge, situated 50 miles to his rear at Falling Waters on the Potomac River, was attacked at the very same time Lee was engaged in planning the retreat. As the wounded soldiers were lifted into ambulances in all the hospitals behind Lee's lines, there were goodbyes. Many were final goodbyes. The ambulances of Ewell's Corps arrived at sites along and on either side of the Fairfield Road in the early morning hours of July 4. Even the lifeless body of Colonel Isaac E. Avery of the 6th North Carolina remained in a quartermaster wagon, placed there the previous evening by his slave who wanted the colonel's remains buried in North Carolina. Before he died, Irwin had penned a note to his wounded regimental major that read, "Tell Father I died with my face to the enemy." The senior surgeon in Ewell's Corps who had been instructed to remain behind was Dr. John M. Hayes of the 26th Alabama. Even as the ambulances were being loaded, Dr. Hayes was occupied at the Cobean House along the Carlisle Road, along with Dr. Harvey Black of the 4th Virginia and the 2nd Corps Field Hospital, amputating the left leg of General Isaac R. Trimble, who had fallen at the climax of the Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble attack on July 3rd. Ambulances were being filled in Hill's Corps hospital sites also. Among the prominent officers placed in ambulances were Generals William Dorsey Pender and Alfred Moore Scales of North Carolina, who were laid side by side in one ambulance with their aides and slaves. More of the same was visible in the hospitals of Longstreet's 3 divisions. General John Bell Hood was placed in an ambulance at the Plank Farm. He was accompanied by his longtime surgeon, Dr. Darby. Darby would actually direct that the badly wounded General Wade Hampton be transferred to Hood's ambulance, as Darby had been Hampton's surgeon throughout the time that Hampton's Legion was part of Hood's old Texas Brigade. Dr. John S.D. Cullen, Longstreet's medical director, oversaw the assembling of the ambulance trains of Longstreet's 3 divisions. In all, Lee's medical officers were able to evacuate more than 9,000 critically wounded and sick officers and men. Along the Chambersburg Pike, from Cashtown all the way back to Her Ridge Road, General Imboden assembled the wagon and ambulance trains of Hill's and Longstreet's Corps and Stuart's Cavalry Division. Assigned to Imboden by General William Nelson Pendleton, Lee's chief of artillery, were elements of artillery batteries from Hill's and Longstreet's battalions, as well as the Stuart Horse Artillery Brigades. When combined with the 4 guns of Captain John McClanahan's Virginia Battery in Imboden's own brigade, he would have a total of 20 pieces of artillery to protect the wagon and ambulance trains under his protection. General Fitzhugh Lee's and Colonel Lawrence Baker's cavalry brigades, formerly Wade Hampton's, would follow Imboden's trains, screening their rear and right flank. At 3 o'clock in the morning of July 4, and less than 2 hours after his departure from Lee's council at General Hill's headquarters, Major Harmon got the immense reserve wagon train of quartermaster and subsistence stores underway on the Ortana Road toward Fairfield. Ahead of the reserve train rode Major Ridgely Brown's 1st Maryland Cavalry, accompanied by the 4 guns of the Courtney, Virginia Artillery. Protecting the approaches to the wagon trains moving through Fairfield from the direction of Emmitsburg were the cavalry brigades of General William E. Grumble Jones and General Beverly Robertson, along with Chew's Virginia Battery, situated at the junction of the Mariah Furnace Road and the Jacks Mountain Road. Accompanied by 5,000 to 7,000 cattle and nearly the same number of sheep, the train rumbled through Fairfield all during the morning hours of July 4. As the roads were generally dry, the wagon train made good speed. The daylight brought intermittent showers. By early afternoon, the showers became steady. Anticipating that the immense reserve train would clear Fairfield by mid-afternoon, surgeons, assistant surgeons, nurses, and stewards in all of the temporary hospitals established by Ewell's 3 divisions on either side of the Fairfield Road began lifting those critically wounded soldiers who had been taken out of the ambulances for emergency treatment back into the vehicles. Some had died, and they were buried in the fields alongside the temporary hospital sites. Some were too critical to move any farther and were left to fall into the hands of the enemy. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon of July 4, the last elements of the reserve train began passing through Fairfield. It had taken 11 hours. Major Harmon then called upon the wagon and ambulance train of the rear division in line, that of General Rhodes, to move onto the Fairfield Road toward Fairfield and into line behind the reserve train. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the very windows of heaven opened up and rain fell in blinding sheets. As the last of Rhodes's wagons entered Fairfield, General Early's wagon and ambulance trains were directed into line. They were followed by General Johnson's division trains late at night. When fully stretched out on the road, the wagon and ambulance trains under Major Harmon's command extended for more than 40 miles. As Major Harmon began the movement of the division trains of Ewell's Corps on the Fairfield Road, General Imboden set in motion the wagon and ambulance trains of Generals Hill's and Longstreet's Corps and General J.E.B. Stuart's Cavalry Division on the Chambersburg Pike. Imboden directed his immense wagon and ambulance trains up the Chambersburg Pike, through the Cashtown Pass, and onto the Walnut Bottom and Pine Stump roads. Rain poured down in sheets. Wind blew the canvas covers of the wagons and ambulances off their moorings, exposing everyone in them. The roads selected for Imboden's wagon and ambulance trains were among the worst in the region. They were hilly, rocky, and it was said by a local resident, muddy and swampy during heavy rains. General Imboden left a remarkable description of the wagon and ambulance trains he directed. My orders, he recalled, had been peremptory, that there should be no halt for any cause whatsoever. If an accident should happen to any vehicle, it was immediately to be put out of the road and abandoned. The column moved rapidly, considering the rough roads and darkness, and from almost every wagon for many miles issued heart-rending wails of agony. For 4 hours, I hurried forward on my way to the front, and in all that time, I was never out of hearing of the screams and cries of the wounded and dying. Scarcely 1 in 100 had received adequate surgical aid, owing to the demands on the hard-working surgeons from still worse cases that had been left behind. Many of the wounded in the wagons had been without food for 36 hours. Their torn and bloody clothing, matted and hardened, was rasping the tender, inflamed, and still oozing wounds. Very few in the wagons had even a layer of straw in them, and all were without springs. The road was rough and rocky from the heavy washing of the preceding day. The jolting was enough to have killed strong men if long exposed to it. From nearly every wagon as the teams trotted on, urged by whip and shout, came such cries and shrieks as these. "Oh God, why can't I die? My God, will no one have mercy and kill me? Stop, oh, for God's sake, stop for just 1 minute. Take me out and leave me to die on the roadside. I'm dying, I'm dying. My poor wife, my dear children, what will become of you?" When finally stretched out on the road, Imboden's columns of wagons and ambulances extended for more than 17 miles. As the journey continued in the mud, the column would eventually stretch out until it reached over 30 miles in length. When Major Harmon's and General Imboden's wagon and ambulance trains were fully on the roads, they together extended for more than 57 miles. General George Gordon Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, was not idle. With only scant information from his signal stations atop the Adams County Courthouse and Little Round Top, Meade was able to learn of the immense wagon trains gathering along the Chambersburg Pike and Fairfield Road. General Meade directed the cavalry brigade of General J. Irvin Gregg of the 2nd Cavalry Division to move around what he understood to be the Confederate left flank and to try to intercept any wagons moving through the Cashtown Pass toward Chambersburg. General Meade then sent orders to General Hugh Judson Kilpatrick to move his 3rd Cavalry Division from its position on the Baltimore Pike near Littlestown and Two Taverns toward Emmitsburg and Monterey Pass. Looking at his map, Meade knew that Lee's wagon trains would have to negotiate Monterey Pass if they were moving along the Fairfield Road. Kilpatrick was directed to not only strike those trains if he could, but send information to Army headquarters of Lee's movements. To General John Buford, whose 1st Cavalry Division was then at Westminster, feeding and reshoeing its horses and feeding the men, orders came from General Meade's headquarters directing him to move out at once toward Frederick, Maryland. He instructed Buford to put his division into position to strike Lee's trains in the Cumberland Valley by moving through Turner Pass. Gregg's brigade, Kilpatrick's division, and Buford's division got underway on the afternoon of July 4. No sooner had they started than the rain fell in sheets, slowing their movement. Many of the horses and the men in those cavalry commands had not been fed for days, making their lengthy movements over rough terrain exceedingly difficult. Behind Major Harmon's immense wagon and ambulance trains, Lee directed his troops to begin their long and difficult trek back to Virginia. General Hill's Corps, holding the center of Lee's defense lines at Gettysburg, was ordered to move into line first. As Hill's men, bloodied and thinned from battle losses, moved into line, pioneer teams using coal oil set fire to their hastily constructed log breastworks. Lee would use the dense smoke to partly obscure the movement of his troops. General Longstreet's columns filled the fields on either side of the Willoughby Run Road, waiting to get into line behind Hill's columns. The wait by Longstreet's men was exasperating. The pace of the immense columns of wagons, ambulances, and Hill's marching troops was exceedingly slow. The rain poured. In long streets, dense columns of troops waited without any shelter all through the night. As Longstreet's corps waited on the Willoughby Run Road, Ewell's corps, after evacuating its breastworks along Oak and Seminary ridges, marched down the Her Ridge Road to the Fairfield Road and formed battle lines on either side of the Fairfield Road to protect the columns marching toward Fairfield and to protect those, Longstreet's corps, waiting to get into line. The retreat of Lee's army was not conducted without some difficulties. Protecting Major Harmon's wagon and ambulance trains at Monterey Pass in the dark, rainy night of July 4 were only 2 companies of the 1st Maryland Cavalry and 1 artillery piece from the Courtney, Virginia Artillery. That one gun had, it appears, only about 12 rounds of ammunition in its limber chest. The remaining 3 guns of the Courtney, Virginia Artillery continued on protecting the head of the reserve train along with the remaining companies of the 1st Maryland Cavalry. Protecting the enormous trains from being attacked from the east at Monterey Pass was Company B of the 1st Maryland Cavalry, commanded by Captain George Malcolm Emack, a native of Beltsville, Maryland. Emack positioned his company midway down the slope of the eastern face of South Mountain, on either side of the Emmitsburg-Waynesboro Turnpike, just below the Monterey House, a popular mountain resort hotel. The 1 artillery piece occupied the center of Emack's lines. Company A of the 1st Maryland occupied a position on either side of the turnpike along the western face of the mountain. Then galloping up the Emmitsburg-Waynesboro Turnpike toward Monterey Pass was the division of Union cavalry commanded by General Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, 4,200 strong, with 3 batteries of regular United States horse artillery. In the lead of Kilpatrick's column was the brigade of 5 Michigan cavalry regiments commanded by none other than newly commissioned Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer. The rain continued to fall in blinding sheets. Lightning bolts exploded in the darkness. Kilpatrick's columns, exhausted due to almost ceaseless duty, cautiously rode up the turnpike. Then, just past Fountaindale, the 1st Michigan troopers came across a little girl who was no more than 12 years old by the name of Hetty Zeilinger, whose family lived on the summit of Monterey Pass near the Monterey House Hotel. The troopers asked Hetty if she knew what was ahead. Pointing to the summit of Monterey Pass, she told them there were Confederate cavalry and an artillery piece protecting a huge wagon train. They asked her if she would lead them up the steep road. She agreed. The column of 4,200 cavalrymen with 3 batteries of artillery were led through the darkness by the directions of a 12-year-old girl. As Kilpatrick's troopers reached a point about 1/4 of a mile ahead and 50 feet below the position of Captain Emack's dismounted cavalrymen and their 1 artillery piece, the Virginia cannoneers pulled the lanyard on their 1 gun, and its deafening report echoed through the darkness while its canister whirred through the air. Some Union cavalrymen, half asleep, were so startled they fell out of their saddles. Soon, though, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, accompanied by the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, dismounted and advanced against Emack's position. Kilpatrick's division pressed forward until Emack's troopers and their lone artillery piece took up a position 600 yards to the rear at the intersection of the Emmitsburg-Waynesboro Turnpike and the Mariah Furnace Road. Behind Emack's position, the huge wagon trains continued to rumble up the Mariah Furnace Road and onto the Emmitsburg-Waynesboro Turnpike toward Waterloo and Waynesboro. Kilpatrick's Union columns formed around the Monterey House Hotel. General Custer directed the 5th and 6th Michigan Cavalry to advance, dismounted, toward Emack's Confederate defenders. Rifle fire erupted all along the summit. Just then, Grumble Jones appeared on horseback behind Emack, demanding that the wagon trains be started again. Jones promised Emack he would bring up what reinforcements he could. In all, they would amount to only a few hundred troopers of the 6th Virginia Cavalry and the 4th North Carolina Cavalry. The Michigan regiments fought their way closer to Emack. Custer directed 2 of Captain Pennington's rifled guns to unlimber and fire explosive shell toward the passing wagon and ambulance trains. He then directed the 1st West Virginia Cavalry and Company A of the 1st Ohio Cavalry to draw their sabers and attack Captain Emack's thin lines on horseback. In one of the most dramatic moments of the Civil War, Custer led his mounted commands directly into Emack's lines while lightning bolts flashed overhead. Briefly, the fighting in front of the wagon trains was hand-to-hand. Captain Emack fell with multiple saber blows to his head, shoulders, and arms, and his horse was killed. The heavy Union columns broke through the Confederate defenders. And soon the entire division of Union cavalry was galloping down the long column of wagons and ambulances of Rodes's division between the summit of Monterey Pass and Waterloo, capturing more than 250 wagons and nearly 1,300 prisoners, mostly wounded officers and men, and African-American teamsters, laborers, and slaves. Among those captured were the wounded Colonel Thomas S. Keenan of the 43rd North Carolina and Major Charles C. Blacknall of the 23rd North Carolina. Narrowly escaping capture was Major Blacknall's commander, Colonel Daniel Harvey Christie. All of the African-American slaves and cooks of the 3rd Company of the Richmond Howitzers were taken by Kilpatrick's troopers. Also seized was the payroll of General Junius Daniels' brigade quartermaster. Kilpatrick, though, was in a difficult position. His entire division was now west of the South Mountain Range. He suspected that elements of Lee's army were hurrying to Monterey Pass. Indeed, they were. Lee's infantry columns were on the march toward Fairfield and the South Mountain Range. Once in the Cumberland Valley, General Imboden's immense wagon and ambulance trains continued their slow journey toward Williamsport through the driving rain and deep mud. Passing through New Franklin, Marion, and Greencastle, Pennsylvania, they headed due south on the Cumberland Valley Turnpike. Attacked once just below Greencastle on the morning of July 5th by a roving cavalry command under Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, Imboden personally called up elements of his 4 regiments protecting the wagon and ambulance trains and beat back the attackers. By late afternoon, July 5th, as the leading elements of Imboden's trains were just then entering Williamsport, the long column, extending then nearly 31 miles, was struck again. This time the attackers were elements of the 1st New York and 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry regiments that had fled to Bloody Run in Bedford County, Pennsylvania in mid-June when General Ewell's corps attacked and overwhelmed General Robert H. Milroy's Union occupational forces at Winchester, Virginia and Martinsburg, West Virginia. Under the command of Captain Abram Jones of the 1st New York, the Union cavalry, having approached Imboden's trains from Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, struck them at a place called Cunningham's Crossroads, inflicting serious damage on the wagon and ambulance trains of Hill's Corps and taking more than 650 prisoners, in excess of 300 of whom were badly wounded. Among the prisoners was the wounded Colonel Collett Leventhorpe of the 11th North Carolina. After beating back the attackers, Imboden's wagon and ambulance trains continued on to Williamsport.
In the wee hours of July 5th, John Harmon's 40-mile-long wagon train began to arrive in Williamsport. The rain was pouring down in torrents. That train was directed down here to the bottomlands in attempts to try to get as many of those wagons across the Potomac River as possible. The river was rapidly rising with the falling rains,
and soon the ford was completely obliterated. And all that was left to transport those wagons across the Potomac River was a ferry that ran on a cable from the Maryland side to the West Virginia side, operated by a man named Robert Lemon, whose house, Maidstone on the Potomac, is still standing on the West Virginia side. Those wagons continued to pour in here over the next 46 hours. On the afternoon of July 5th, the leading elements of John Imboden's 17-mile-long train of wagons began to move into Williamsport, too. Those trains were also directed down here, and soon, by the end of that day, there were nearly 5,000 wagons in these bottomlands with all their 4- and 6-horse and mule teams, accompanied by all the cattle, all the sheep, all the hogs, and other subsistence carried along by this army. One veteran of Pickett's division looking at this wrote in his diary that looking at this spectacle that he thought was so incredible, it reminded him more of the Mormon Exodus than it did of a military operation.
With no bridge at Falling Waters, Lee's wagon trains carrying the stores his army had seized in Pennsylvania were trapped. Canal boats were then lifted out of the C&O Canal and launched in the Potomac River. Connected to the two shores by means of ropes, the canal boats hauled wagons and ambulances across the river around the clock. Williamsport became a vast hospital. On either side of Potomac Street, and along all the cross streets from the Canal Basin to the Toll House, on the Hagerstown Turnpike, Longstreet's, Ewell's, and Hill's Corps set up temporary hospitals for those sick and wounded in desperate need of medical and surgical attention. To protect the immense wagon and ambulance trains gathering in the town, Imboden collected all the armed forces at his disposal and developed a defense line along a ridge about 1 mile east and north of town, protecting the approaches from those two directions. His own independent cavalry brigade formed the center of those lines, all dismounted. The better parts of 2 infantry regiments, the 31st and 58th Virginia, that had protected the Williamsport ford throughout Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, were added to Imboden's defenses. In addition, Captain William Pegram's Company F 21st Virginia Infantry was ferried across the river from its bivouac site near Maidstone on the Potomac. By mid-afternoon, July 5th, the 54th North Carolina Infantry appeared on the West Virginia shore of the Potomac River. It had arrived there escorting Lee's long overdue wagon train of reserve ammunition, all the way from Richmond, Virginia to Stanton and down the Shenandoah Valley to the Potomac River. Wounded officers in the ambulance trains like Colonel William Delaney of Cobb's Legion and Colonel William Eilert of the 53rd Virginia organized companies of wounded soldiers, armed them from weapons found in the quartermaster trains, and sent them to the defense lines. Using 2-gun sections, Imboden directed the placement of artillery in positions from the Cumberland Valley Turnpike all the way to below the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road. The whole success of the invasion, in fact, the life of the Army itself, depended upon the successful defense of the wagon trains that jammed in Williamsport and along the bottomland between the canal and the Potomac River. As General Kilpatrick's weary columns galloped along the western face of the South Mountain Range toward Boonesboro in the early morning hours of July 5th, General Buford's 1st Cavalry Division headed toward Frederick through driving rains in an effort to get across the South Mountain Range in order to intercept Lee's enormous wagon trains. Not far from Emmitsburg, Buford added General Wesley Merritt's reserve brigade to his columns. The men and horses were weary and hungry. So desperate were their needs that Merritt's troopers lost over 200 horses due to lack of forage and shoes during the journey between Emmitsburg and Frederick. Once in Frederick, Buford was informed by a civilian observer of the tremendous wagon trains with its herds of livestock that had been moving through Hagerstown and heading toward Williamsport all through the night of July 5th. Knowing the Potomac River was swollen and Lee's pontoon bridge had been destroyed, Buford determined to strike the wagon trains in Williamsport the next morning. He was confident of success, as informants told him the trains were protected only by a small contingent of cavalry and some inferior artillery. Buford's troopers awoke early in the morning of July 6th to the sound of boots and saddles. They mounted their horses and headed up the National Road, present-day US 40A, toward Middletown and Turner Pass. Late in the morning, Buford's long columns met elements of Kilpatrick's division, just west of Boonesboro. There, Kilpatrick told Buford of the vast wagon trains he had broken at Monterey Pass. Buford informed Kilpatrick of the intelligence he had received at Frederick the night before. Those wagon trains were still rumbling through Hagerstown, Kilpatrick reported, and his division was in a position to strike them in Hagerstown. Kilpatrick and Buford decided on a two-pronged attack. Kilpatrick would proceed up the National Road through Funkstown and strike the wagon trains still moving through the streets of Hagerstown. Buford would move west up the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road and strike the wagon trains that were backed up in Williamsport waiting to cross the Potomac River. Kilpatrick's movements were not unnoticed by the Confederates protecting the immense wagon trains moving through Hagerstown. Elements of Colonel John R. Chambliss's Gray Cavalry Brigade had reached the town. Colonel James Lucius Davis of the 10th Virginia Cavalry was alerted. A screen of vedettes from Colonel R.L.T. Beale's 9th Virginia Cavalry, posted just north of Funkstown, observed Kilpatrick's approach. Colonel Davis received word of the massive Union columns heading toward Hagerstown. He ordered his troopers to hurriedly construct a barricade along South Potomac Street, just south of St. John's Lutheran Church. Skirmish fire broke out in the early afternoon between the Confederate vedettes and General Kilpatrick's skirmishers. The heavy blue columns passed Hager's Mill just southeast of Hagerstown. Gunfire intensified. In the open field south of Hagerstown, Kilpatrick massed his troopers. Riding up to Kilpatrick was Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, who had found his way around Lee's trains. Dahlgren asked Kilpatrick if he could lead an attack up Potomac Street. Kilpatrick heartily agreed. Calling up squadrons of the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, the 1st West Virginia Cavalry, and the 1st Vermont Cavalry, all from Colonel Nathaniel Richmond's brigade, Dahlgren advanced them up South Potomac Street toward the Confederate defenders. Then, yelling for his men to charge, Dahlgren led the blue squadrons directly toward Colonel Davis's barricade at a gallop. From behind the barricade and from building windows, heavy small arms fire dismounted some of Dahlgren's troopers. Soon the whole southern suburbs of the town exploded in rifle fire. Dahlgren led his galloping columns into and over the barricade, overwhelming the advance lines of the 9th and 10th Virginia Cavalry regiments at the barricade. Dahlgren led his columns to the center square of Hagerstown. There, the Virginians rallied. Elements of General Beverly Robertson's brigade of North Carolinians, just entering the town on North Potomac Street, hurried to the aid of the Virginians. The battle in the streets of Hagerstown was severe. The cutting and slashing, wrote one Pennsylvania trooper, was beyond description. Slowly, the Confederates were forced back from the town square. On Church Street, among the tombstones of and around Zion Reformed Church, the Confederate resistance stiffened. Meanwhile, in the eastern suburbs of the town, Colonel Milton J. Ferguson's brigade with Chew's Virginia Battery arrived. Chew's guns unlimbered and began shelling the Union attackers in Hagerstown. To meet the threat, Kilpatrick ordered the 5th New York Cavalry, along with a squadron of the 1st Vermont and Elder's United States Battery, to hold off the Confederate advance east of town. The battle for the possession of Hagerstown intensified. It was after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Moving down the turnpike and into North Potomac Street was General Alfred M. Iverson's little brigade of North Carolina infantry. Their presence would turn the tide. Iverson's men filtered into the thin Confederate defenses along Church Street. They unleashed several infantry volleys and then, in battle formation, advanced south, forcing the Union troopers, some mounted, some dismounted, to give ground. In the fighting, Captain Dahlgren fell badly wounded. He was taken back to an ambulance south of town. As the gunfire grew in intensity in Hagerstown, Buford's 3 brigades galloped up the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road closer to Williamsport. Buford pushed forward, still believing that Williamsport was virtually undefended and that the vast wagon trains congregating there were his for the taking. When Buford reached the Downsville-Hagerstown Road, he called for his 2 advanced brigades to dismount. Merritt's brigade would attack Williamsport on the north side of the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road, while Colonel William Gamble's brigade would attack south of the road. Colonel Thomas Devon's brigade, mounted, was held in reserve. Skirmishers were ordered to head on foot as the cavalrymen, all dismounted, approached the Confederate defenses in columns as though they were infantry. Each brigade was supported by a battery of rifled guns that unlimbered and fired into the Confederate defenses. Merritt's attack north of the road was making progress. General Imboden believed his hard-pressed Confederates could not hold out much longer. South of the road, Captain William Pegram advanced his little company along the Downsville Road and into the fields of Otho Williams' farm just north and west of the impressive Williams house known as Rose Hill. Advancing against Pegram were elements of the 8th Illinois Cavalry, led by Major William Medill. Buck Miller brought forward his 2 guns of the 3rd Company of the Washington Artillery of New Orleans and shelled Gamble's columns. The fighting south of the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road became ferocious. Pegram was killed, and Major Medill fell from his horse, mortally wounded. Imboden ordered all of his troops north of the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road to advance. One 2-gun section of the Washington Artillery of New Orleans, Captain Charles Squire's guns, was advanced out the Williamsport-Hagerstown Turnpike and began shelling Merritt's right flank. Just then, Imboden observed heavy columns of mounted troops advancing toward his left flank. It was General Fitzhugh Lee's Confederate Cavalry Brigade. It had just arrived following the rear of Imboden's long wagon and ambulance trains. Merritt's troopers suddenly halted. General Merritt called upon his regimental commanders to withdraw their commands. Lee's brigade, sabers drawn, descended upon Merritt's right flank. Some of Lee's troopers galloped toward Hagerstown, where they collided with elements of Custer's Michigan Brigade, just then moving to the aid of Merritt from Kilpatrick's position south of Hagerstown. As Merritt withdrew, so did Gamble. In minutes, what had appeared to be a Union breakthrough was now a Union rout. As Buford's division withdrew east toward Jones's Crossroads, Kilpatrick's division was being pushed out of Hagerstown and was falling back toward Jones's Crossroads from the north. Well into the darkness, the fighting continued along the Hagerstown-Sharpsburg Turnpike as one Confederate attack after another slammed into Kilpatrick's retreating columns. One Confederate attack, mounted by Grumble Jones's brigade, struck Kilpatrick from the direction of Funkstown. By midnight, 2 Union divisions, both in near disarray, jammed the fields around Jones's Crossroads. The battles of Hagerstown and Williamsport were over. Kilpatrick's and Buford's divisions had been badly beaten. Lee's immense wagon and ambulance trains, and all the purchased, impressed, and confiscated stores and vast herds of livestock were safe. Meanwhile, back at Gettysburg, Lee's infantry columns moved onto the Fairfield Road all through the morning of July 5th. Longstreet's weary and rain-soaked troops slogged their way up the Willoughby Run Road
and into position behind Hill's slow-moving corps. In the midst of Longstreet's corps, Pickett's division, assigned to guard the prisoners of war, brought the more than 4,000 Union prisoners onto the Fairfield Road in the midst of the enormous columns moving toward Fairfield and Monterey Pass. As the last of Longstreet's troops entered the Fairfield Road, the long columns of Ewell's corps filtered onto the road, leaving behind the Georgia Brigade of General John B. Gordon, along with the Louisiana Guard Artillery, the commands designated as the rear guard of Lee's retreating army. The rear was screened by Colonel Elijah V. White's 35th Battalion of Virginia Cavalry that spread out in a long line behind the retreating infantry columns. Fully aware of Lee's withdrawal up the Fairfield Road toward the South Mountain Range, General Meade put his own army in motion. He directed General John Sedgwick to move his 6th Corps onto Lee's rear and follow it to the mountains. Sedgwick's mission was explicit. He was ordered not to bring on an engagement with Lee, but rather to uncover Lee's intentions. Many of Meade's senior commanders were convinced that Lee was withdrawing to the South Mountain Range in order to fortify a position there. Meade, however, was not convinced at first. He believed Lee was in full retreat toward Virginia, and he acted on that belief. He directed all of his corps to march as quickly as possible to Frederick and Middletown, Maryland. There, the army would advance through Turner's, Fox's, and Crampton's passes and into the Cumberland Valley to hopefully intercept Lee before he could cross the river.
On the morning of July 5th, Dr. Simon Baruch and Dr. J.F. Pierce were seated out here on the lawn. They were roasting a peacock that they had found, the first meal they had had in days. All morning long, they had seen the columns of Lee's retreating army move up the Fairfield Road. As Dr. Baruch looked up onto the ridge, he saw an entire column of Union cavalry with sabers drawn, flashing in the sun. As that cavalry moved down into this yard behind them came literally endless columns of General Horatio Wright's division of General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps, the corps that General Meade had sent out to pursue Lee's army as it retreated up the Fairfield Road. A captain came up to Dr. Baruch and asked him, "Are there any Confederates around here?" And he said, "No, only wounded ones." And so the 6th Corps moved on into Lee's rear, pressuring him all the way to Fairfield.
Lee's rear guard periodically halted, formed battle lines, unlimbered the 4 guns, and opened a blistering fire on Sedgwick's advancing troops. With virtually all of his army in a position to aid his rear guard, Lee constantly offered Sedgwick opportunities to attack. "Draw the enemy to us," Lee said to Generals Ewell and Early, "and then smash them." Sedgwick was not about to take the bait. Darkness fell on the afternoon of July 5th, with Ewell's corps at the base of the South Mountain Range on either side of the Mariah Furnace Road. Longstreet's corps had reached the base of the South Mountain Range at Monterey Gap on either side of the Emmitsburg-Waynesboro Turnpike. Both Ewell and Longstreet directed their troops to construct breastworks along a military crest of the mountains. Axes and shovels were heard all through the night in the pouring rain. Bonfires were lighted behind the log and earthen breastworks, making it appear Lee's men were there to stay.
This is the Mariah Furnace Road leading to the entrance to Monterey Pass. And as darkness fell, Lee had all of those troops in Ewell's corps build breastworks and light fires along the base of the South Mountain Range. And as General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps came to this site, after fighting a series of spirited engagements with General John Gordon's rear guard of Lee's army, he reached this site and saw all the fires, and his advance cavalry noted that there were breastworks being built.
So John Sedgwick sends a message to General George Gordon Meade telling him that he believes that Lee is fortifying the mountains. When that message reaches General Meade cancels all the orders he had issued for the army to move toward Frederick and Middletown, and he would wait here for fear of moving his base of supply at Westminster too precipitately. So for 30 hours, the Army of the Potomac waits until they determine whether or not Lee is actually fortifying the mountains here or whether he is actually going to retreat across these mountains to the Cumberland Valley. It wasn't until July 6, late in the afternoon, that John McIntosh's cavalry brigade moved into that pass and discovered that those breastworks had been abandoned. Messages were quickly relayed to General Sedgwick and Warren. They in turn sent gallopers to General Meade. Lee continued to move his immense wagon trains. All through the night of July 5th and the morning of July 6th, Lee's wagon and ambulance trains rumbled toward Williamsport. Orders were issued on the early morning of July 6th for the Army to begin its movement across the mountains and into the Cumberland Valley. Longstreet's corps moved first, followed by Hill's and then Ewell's. On receiving Sedgwick's and Warren's message, Meade reissued the orders he had canceled 30 hours before. He directed all 7 of his corps to march to Frederick and Middletown. It was now a race to the Potomac River. Meade immediately ordered his base of supply changed from Westminster on the Western Maryland Railroad to Frederick on the B&O. With rain pouring down and the roads deep in mud, Meade's hungry army, its horses and mules starved for forage and in desperate need of shoes, slogged its way to Middletown. West of the South Mountain Range, Lee's army was rapidly moving toward Hagerstown. As Lee's army was now on macadamized roads all the way to Hagerstown, it picked up speed. Meade was not to be outdone. In an incredible 2 days, Meade's army reached Middletown and began its movement across the South Mountain Range through Turner's, Fox's, and Crampton's passes, the same passes made famous in the battles of South Mountain on September 14, 1862. So desperate for fodder were Meade's horses and mules that many could not make the ascent up the National Road from Middletown to Turner's and Fox's passes. They could not pull the field artillery. At Crampton's Pass, the 12th Corps was slowed by weakened animals. So bad was Meade's situation that between Gettysburg and Middletown, his army lost 15,000 horses and mules to breakdown and death. They literally littered the roadways. Lee and his engineers, along with Colonel E. Porter Alexander, rode along the ridges and hills between Hagerstown and the Potomac River in an effort to identify the best defensive line. By the evening of July 9, Lee and his engineers had identified a defense line. They chose a broken ridge line that ran from just west of Hagerstown all the way to Downsville, known locally as Salisbury Ridge. Lee directed General J.E.B. Stuart to move his cavalry brigades out the National Road toward Beaver Creek and Boonesboro, and out the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road to Boonesboro. He admonished his cavalry chief that his troopers were to, at all costs, hold back any enemy advance up those roads toward Hagerstown and Williamsport until the defense lines could be completed and filled with the troops. Lee then ordered his corps commanders to direct large details of infantrymen, artillerymen, and non-combatants, including many of the African-American slaves accompanying the wagon and ambulance trains, to prepare breastworks and gun emplacements along Salisbury Ridge in accordance with the plans drawn up for the defenses by the engineers. Work began on July 9 and continued throughout the night and all through July 10. All through that time, Stuart's horsemen battled Meade's cavalry advance, trying desperately to buy time. General Meade's Union troops were on the move. Advancing up the National Road from Boonesboro was General John Buford's cavalry division. Behind it was General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps. Stuart battled Buford all the way back up the National Road. Stuart withdrew to Funkstown, and there, in the afternoon of July 10, he directed one more concerted effort to buy more time for Lee's army to finish the Salisbury Ridge defense lines and to fill them. In command east of Funkstown was General Fitzhugh Lee. He called upon Colonel William White, commanding the wounded General George T. Anderson's brigade of Hood's division, to hurry his Georgians across the Stone Bridge, over Antietam Creek, march through Funkstown, and come to the aid of his weary cavalrymen in the rolling fields east of the town. They were brought into line just as Buford's Union artillery batteries opened fire. Behind White's Georgians, Fitzhugh Lee directed Colonel Goody Bryan's Georgia Brigade, formerly commanded by General Paul Jones Semmes, who had been wounded at Gettysburg, to extend the Confederate line east of Funkstown. The Confederate line extended between the Stonebreaker Barn on the left and the Huck Barn along the National Road on the right. The fighting intensified as General Sedgwick's leading brigade, the Vermonters under Colonel Lewis A. Grant, came into line alongside Buford's dismounted troopers. Among those who fell badly wounded in the fighting east of Funkstown was Colonel Henry Dickerson McDaniel of the 11th Georgia. He would survive the war to become governor of Georgia. While Stuart's cavalry brigades battled General Meade's advancing Union 6th Corps on the National Road east of Funkstown, and on the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road on July 10, Lee's troops began to fill the trench lines. As evening fell, Stuart and Fitzhugh Lee withdrew the Confederate troops back out of Funkstown and across Antietam Creek. From positions north of Hagerstown, Ewell's Corps had filtered into the defense lines west of the city. Rhodes's division occupying the left flank, Early's division occupying the center, and Johnson's division occupying the right flank and connecting with the left flank of Hill's Corps. Pender's division of Hill's Corps occupied the left, extending to a brick schoolhouse. Heath's division occupied Hill's center, and Anderson's division held Hill's right, overlooking St. James College. Longstreet's corps held the right flank of the defense lines. McLaws's division holding the left, with its left flank touching the right flank of Anderson's division of Hill's Corps on the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road. Hood's division held the extreme right, extending the Confederate lines to below Downsville, not far from the Potomac River. Lee's defense lines were 9 miles long. At critical points along the entire defense line, gun emplacements were built. Because the ridge on which the defense line was constructed was very broken along its entire length, Lee's engineers were able to install gun emplacements that not only were able to fire directly into an advancing line, but also into the flanks of any enemy column that approached the positions. Beyond the superiority of position with respect to an enemy attack, Lee's defenses were also constructed in front of a network of roads that allowed all the elements of the army to quickly move in support of one another and to allow them to evacuate the lines with considerable speed and efficiency. Connecting Lee's left flank, Ewell's Corps, with the probable river crossing site at Williamsport was the Williamsport-Hagerstown Turnpike, now US 11. Connecting Hill's Corps holding the center of the defense lines with Williamsport and the Falling Waters Road to the river crossing at Falling Waters was the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road, present-day Route 68. Behind Longstreet's corps was the Downsville Road that intersected the Falling Waters Road about 2 miles from the river crossing at Falling Waters. The Hagerstown-Downsville Road connected the right flank of Lee's lines with the left and center. The road actually terminated at the site of the toll gate on the Williamsport-Hagerstown Turnpike that Lee had been using as his field headquarters. Between Williamsport and the river crossing at Falling Waters, 3 miles downstream, ran the towpath of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, a necessary connector between the two prospective river crossing sites. Lee consequently positioned his army enviably. It was on ground at least 50 feet higher than its enemy, and all units could rapidly move to the support of one another. As well, the lines could be readily evacuated when the time came. Lee's army had developed what became known as the Downsville Line. Meade's army pursued Lee as closely as the undulating countryside would permit. Up the National Road marched the 6th Corps, followed by the 11th Corps and the 1st Corps, pouring into Funkstown and even entering Hagerstown. Up the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road marched the 5th Corps, followed by the 2nd Corps and the 12th Corps. The 3rd Corps followed behind. Meade's troops moved as far as the Hagerstown-Sharpsburg Turnpike, where they came under fire of the enemy skirmish lines in front of Lee's defenses along Salisbury Ridge. Along the Hagerstown-Sharpsburg Turnpike, from Funkstown to just below Jones's Crossroads, Meade aligned his army facing Lee. On the right was General Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps. To its left was General John Newton's 1st Corps. Then Sedgwick's 6th Corps. General George Sykes's 5th Corps followed, and to its left came General William Hayes's 2nd Corps, with General Henry W. Slocum's 12th Corps anchoring the left. The 3rd Corps, commanded by General William French, was held in reserve near Jones's Crossroads, along with the artillery reserve. Between Meade's lines on the Hagerstown-Sharpsburg Turnpike and Lee's defense lines ran Marsh Run, a small stream that, because of the incessant rains, had already reached anywhere from 5 to 6 feet in depth in places, making any attack by Meade's army upon Lee's lines utterly suicidal. Using church steeples in Hagerstown and Funkstown, as well as abandoned houses between the two contending lines, Meade established signal stations. Here, the Signal Corps set up telescopic observation posts. They continually scanned Lee's lines to determine any movements in them or openings for an attack.
When Lee's troops finished constructing the trench lines between Hagerstown and Downsville, east of Williamsport, on July 10, Lee directed his engineers, along with pioneer teams, to reconstruct a pontoon bridge here at Falling Waters, connecting the Maryland and the West Virginia shores. To do that, Lee needed 26 pontoons. He needed trestle work and bridging to cover a span of 800 feet to bridge this area of the river. The process began on July 10. Most of the pontoons were constructed in Williamsport and floated 3 miles downstream to this site.
One by one, they were put in place upon their arrival at Falling Waters and attached with intricate wooden trestle work. Simultaneously, they were held in place in the swift currents of the Potomac River by means of makeshift anchors made out of large wooden boxes filled with rocks and attached to the pontoons by ropes.
In an incredible 68 hours, these engineers constructed 26 pontoons, 800 feet of bridge work and trestle work, and laid it across here, and by July 12, a pontoon bridge was here at Falling Waters. No sooner had that bridge been constructed than all of Lee's ambulance trains, quartermaster trains, subsistence trains moved off of the C&O Canal onto this bridge and reached the West Virginia shore.
On the night of July 12, Lee learned that the Potomac River had fallen. Where it had been nearly 13 feet in depth 2 days before, it was now just about 5 feet deep at the ford at Williamsport. Lee now saw the opportunity to quickly evacuate the defense lines. He would use both the bridge and the ford. He issued explicit orders to all of his corps commanders. Lee's orders for the evacuation of the defense lines in front of Williamsport were relatively simple. In the empty gun emplacements up and down the 9-mile-long defense line, Lee's men placed logs cut and painted to resemble artillery barrels.
Over those Quaker guns flapped flags made of large square cloth painted red. At dawn, Union observers would see what appeared to be Confederate flags flying over occupied gun emplacements. Lee directed thousands of campfires to remain lighted so it would appear in the darkness that Lee's troops still remained in the trenches. Lee would evacuate the trenches under cover of darkness and heavy smoke. In the evening darkness of July 13, Ewell's Corps began its evacuation of the defense line on the left flank behind Hagerstown.
This entire Army Corps moved out of the trenches west of Hagerstown, moved to Williamsport, and actually came down to the canal to wade through this aqueduct. The soldiers holding their muskets and cartridge boxes above their heads until they reached the west bank. There, they moved down to the Potomac River on the west bank of the Conococheague Creek and crossed the Potomac River at nighttime, holding their muskets above their heads across the river, and it was lighted only by bonfires on the West Virginia side.
All of the quartermaster and subsistence trains traveling with Ewell's divisions were directed by Corley to ford the river using all the ford sites in front of and upstream from Williamsport. Large numbers of wagons were directed onto the towpath of the C&O Canal west, upstream, to fords more than a mile from Williamsport. On the right flank of the defense lines, Longstreet's corps withdrew at the same time as Ewell's. Longstreet's men marched along the Hagerstown, Downsville, and Falling Waters roads toward the pontoon bridge. McLaws's division on the left moved first, followed by Hood's. Torches and burning piles of fence rails lighted the Hagerstown, Downsville, and Falling Waters roads all the way to the river.
One soldier in James Longstreet's corps, Val Giles of the 4th Texas Infantry, remembered this scene. In the late, dark hours of July 13, he was marching across this bridge. He remembered the lightning playing atop Old South Mountain, as he said, and he came to the bridge on the Maryland side, and there he saw Robert E. Lee seated on Traveler. He said he was a veritable claybank, but he sat there sipping a cup of coffee. His troops moved down onto the bridge, and as they did, the regimental band struck up the tune Dixie, and the soldiers began to pick up the cadence, and as they did, the bridge swayed back and forth until the officers hollered out for the men to stop. But the troops marched on, as Val Giles said, in rags and hope.
Later that night, Hill's corps began its movement toward the river. Anderson's division evacuated its trenches overlooking St. James College and headed down the Hagerstown-Downsville Road, then west on the Williamsport-Boonesboro Road. Just east of Williamsport, the division was directed onto the Falling Waters Road. Pender's division, followed by Heath's. General Meade was unable to launch an attack. Visibility from all his signal stations along Marsh Run was extraordinarily limited due to the heavy smoke, rain, and fog. Moreover, the ground over which any attack would have to be directed was so saturated with rain that Marsh Run was at places 5 to 6 feet deep. Meade's cavalry probes around Lee's flanks had also proved discouraging to him. General Meade nevertheless called a council of war at his headquarters at Jones's Crossroad. Although he voiced support for an attack of some kind, his corps commanders demurred, most believing it could never succeed. On the morning of July 14, General Kilpatrick moved his cavalry division forward. He received virtually no resistance. As he approached Lee's defense lines, he found no resistance. Lee's army had abandoned them. Kilpatrick's division soon galloped into Williamsport. Finding the town empty save for the desperately wounded left behind in the makeshift hospitals, along with surgical teams and stragglers, Kilpatrick directed his division toward Falling Waters after hearing that Lee's army had passed that way to cross the river. General Hill's corps of Lee's army was just then crossing the pontoon bridge. General Richard H. Anderson's division was on the bridge. Pender's division under General Lane was behind it, and Heath's division was 1.5 miles back up the Falling Waters Road, manning breastworks. It was the rear guard of the bridge crossing. The tired and muddy soldiers of Heath's division had stacked their muskets. On the road, around the J.M. Downey House, was General Pettigrew's brigade, along with the mostly Tennessee Brigade formerly commanded by General James J. Archer, who had been captured at Gettysburg. General John Broken Burrows and General Joseph Davis's brigades formed on the right of the road, extending along a dominant ridge. As Kilpatrick's Union division reached a point about 1/4 of a mile in front of Heath's rear guard around the Downey House, Major Peter Weber of the 6th Michigan Cavalry volunteered to lead a battalion of his regiment against the Confederate defenders. He believed them to be small in number and generally too weak to resist an attack. In a moment, Weber's troopers galloped through the fog and haze toward the Confederate rear guard. Because of the lay of the land, the attack became directed toward the right flank of the Confederate line, Brockenborough's and Davis's brigades. The Union horsemen struck the Confederate lines before the defenders were able to fully organize battle lines. There was an initial breakthrough across the road from the Downey House. General Pettigrew, whose brigade was hardly touched by the attack, fell mortally wounded near the Downey barn, the result of a well-aimed pistol shot from a dismounted Michigan trooper. On the Confederate right, where the full force of the attack was felt, the resistance quickly stiffened. Once the Michiganders broke through Heath's division, they ran into Pender's full division drawn up in battle formation. The fighting was over in minutes. Weber was killed and his troopers beaten back with considerable loss. Finally, Pender's division, followed by Heath's, marched across the pontoon bridge at Falling Waters. The last regiment to cross the bridge was the 26th North Carolina, the very regiment that played such a remarkable role in the opening of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1. The pontoon bridge was dismantled and its pontoons and bridge work placed upon wagons. Lee's army would use them again. Lee's army marched to Bunker Hill, West Virginia, between Winchester, Virginia, and Martinsburg, West Virginia. There, the army went into bivouac along one of the few streams that had not been polluted by the occupation of Winchester. There also, General Pettigrew died on July 17. From Martinsburg, the sick and wounded who could continue the journey were sent to Winchester in ambulance trains. Those who could walk were ordered to do so. Winchester was the receiving hospital for the Shenandoah Valley. The sick were mostly directed to the makeshift hospital set up at Jordan, White Sulphur Springs, east of town. Dr. Harvey Black of the 4th Virginia was ordered to oversee that facility. The wounded were sent to the town of Winchester. There, Major John Bridgeford of the 1st Virginia Irish Battalion commanded the town. More than 9,000 sick and wounded poured into the town of Winchester and Jordan, White Sulphur Springs. At Winchester, Colonel Daniel Harvey Christie of the 23rd North Carolina, who had been badly wounded on July 1, died after his harrowing journey from Gettysburg. Using ambulance trains made up of Army ambulances, civilian wagons, and even stage coaches, the sick and wounded were sent south, up the Valley Turnpike. The ambulance trains left the Taylor Hotel and Courthouse on regular scheduled runs. 50 miles south of Winchester, the ambulance train stopped at Mount Jackson, a wayside hospital directed during Lee's retreat from Gettysburg by Dr. Robert Baldwin of Winchester. In all, more than 600 were left behind at Mount Jackson under the care of Dr. Baldwin and his assistant surgeons, stewards, and nurses. On up the Valley Turnpike, the ambulance trains rumbled. Those able to walk hobbled alongside the trains. They passed through Harrisonburg, where the brave artillery commander, Major Joseph Latimer, was left behind and died. Finally, the ambulance trains entered Stanton, the site of the General Hospital of the Shenandoah Valley.
Ambulance trains would arrive at Stanton around the clock for the next 2 to 3 weeks. There, the wounded were received at the American Hotel, the receiving hospital located at the foot of New and Augusta Streets, a structure that still stands. The sick and wounded were then assigned to wards in the buildings of the Virginia School for the Deaf, Dumb, and Blind, the principal structures of which also still stand. In all, just under 9,000 sick and wounded Confederates were received at Stanton in July 1863. General William Dorsey Pender arrived at Stanton in the ambulance with General Alfred M. Scales. Although Pender's wound was considered less life-threatening than Scales's, Pender died at Stanton on July 19. Scales was sent on to Richmond, where he survived. The wounded Colonel William Dabney Stewart of the 56th Virginia, a native of Stanton, died in his own home. He had been badly wounded in the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble attack on July 3rd. As the conditions of the sick and wounded permitted, they were put on the trains of the Virginia Central Railroad and transported 100 miles east to the great general hospitals in Richmond. Like the Confederate sick and wounded, the 4,000 Union prisoners of war, guarded from the Potomac River by General Imboden's cavalry brigade, were marched up the Valley Turnpike to Stanton and then put on trains of the Virginia Central Railroad to the prisons in Richmond. Lee used the Valley Turnpike for one other aspect of his operation. All of the livestock seized by the Army while in Pennsylvania and not actually herded along by the troops for their immediate needs were driven up the Shenandoah Valley to Mount Jackson, along with the giant reserve, quartermaster, and subsistence trains of the Army. In all, nearly 26,000 head of cattle and 26,000 head of sheep were taken to Mount Jackson. After Lee's army left Bunker Hill, it crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains near Front Royal and marched to Orange Courthouse. General Meade's Union Army crossed the Potomac River at Berlin, Maryland, and Sandy Hook, Maryland, near Harper's Ferry. Meade had to cross the Potomac east of the Blue Ridge Mountains in order to better protect Washington, always his principal mission. In 10 days, Lee had gotten across the Potomac River an army of more than 50,000 combatants and 20,000 non-combatant support personnel, all 69 artillery batteries, and more than 57 miles of quartermaster, subsistence, ordnance, and ambulance trains filled with purchased, impressed, and confiscated stores. The retreat from Gettysburg was not only a successful military operation, it indeed restored the balance of power between the two contending armies in the East. Though a tactical defeat, the Battle of Gettysburg was hardly the turning point of the Civil War. It cannot now be argued that it was even the turning point of the war in the East. Instead, the bloody contest would go on for the better part of 2 more years.